Friends farewell. Alan Barra had a terrifying encounter in October 1987. Then living alone in a Townsville, Queensland apartment, he was awakened by a sound at about 3:30 one morning. Opening his eyes, he was looking at a man standing at the end of his bed. He tried to shout out, "Who's there?" but found that his lips and tongue seemed to be frozen. He could not even get out a whisper. Thinking that the intruder was a thief, it was even more frightening when he tried to jump out of bed to confront him. His body was totally paralysed, and he was unable to move even a little finger. All he could do was to continue lying there, helpless and fearful, while staring at the man, wondering what harm he might do to him. In the light coming through the window from street lamps, he saw that the man was wearing a dark blue shirt and trousers, the kind of gear which was worn by people doing the tough work on construction sites. Now straining to get a better look, Alan could not see any hands emerging from the shirt sleeves. Also, the man's head was strangely swallowed up in shadow. The figure continued to stand there at the end of his bed for at least 5 minutes, with Alan all the while terrified and convinced that his life was in danger. Then, to his astonishment, the man simply disappeared, and he found that he could move again. He lay awake for the rest of the night, completely mystified and wondering what had just happened to him. However, the next day he understood. Alan's mother came to see him at work and to inform him that his best friend Dave was now deceased. Dave and his partner and her 2 children had been travelling to Sydney when they had collided head-on with a truck just outside of Tamworth. Dave had been burned to death while his family had survived, but with multiple injuries. Alan found out that the accident had occurred at 2 a.m, so about 90 minutes before the figure had appeared in his bedroom. He also went to some lengths to uncover that when Dave was removed from the car wreckage, he was wearing blue work clothes just like those worn by his ethereal intruder. Alan now belatedly realised that the apparition had been Dave's spirit coming to see him one last time to bid a farewell. Although it had been a terrifying experience, he felt very gratified to have had that one last visit from Dave. Regarding his full-body paralysis, witnesses often describe an inability to move or speak in the presence of a ghost. The phenomenon is explained by paranormal researchers as the entity needing to suck energy from everything around it in order to make itself visible. Beauty restored. In 1982, landscape artist Ruth Epps had been caring for her mother Estelle with bowel cancer for 6 years and knew her prognosis was not looking good. Her mum had a phobia about hospitals, so Ruth was helping her at her parents' home in Esperance, Western Australia. One night, when she took a meal to her mother's room, she was surprised to see the figure of a woman sitting by her mother's bed, whom she immediately recognised as her grandmother, her mother's mother. She had died 18 years earlier, and Ruth sensed that her apparition could mean only one thing, that her mother was about to join her. The end came the next day, when Ruth and her father were both in the room caring for her. Ruth described to paranormal researcher John Pinkney that suddenly a beautiful young woman who was bathed in a radiant light ran into the room. Ruth's father then whispered, "Oh Stella," as fully aware as she was that the stunning girl with long brown hair tumbling down her back was her mother, as she had been some 50 years ago. Ruth said that her young mother's face was filled with happiness and her arms were outstretched. Her eyes seemed to be fixed on the far wall of the bedroom. Ruth was sure she could see her own mother, Ruth's nan, and was running to meet her. Pinkney, who has received a huge number of accounts of similar crisis apparitions, states that many of such spectres seem to have had their youthful appearance restored. In one case, Tony Miller of Paddington, New South Wales, saw his uncle in his bedroom at the time he passed. The uncle had lost an arm in an industrial accident, but appeared as incredibly youthful and slim, and with both arms. long-distance apparition. The unexpected spiritual presence of a loved one can be a shock for the person witnessing it, a shock that is often buffered by an obscure image and even a sensation of calm. Equally, distance is no barrier to that spiritual connection, with visions sometimes seen on the other side of the world at the time of what is later realised as the moment of death. In 1985, a Sydney woman was mystified when she was awoken by a blazing brightness in her bedroom, where her door was closed and her blind drawn to prevent outside light filtering in. She later reported that the luminosity was so intense that she could easily read her clock face, which read 5:40 a.m. She watched as a floating ball of light expanded until it took the shape of a floating head with a transparent body underneath. She could plainly see the handles on her cupboard through the apparition, and felt surprised to realise that she was not even afraid. She got out of bed and reached out to touch the ethereal figure, whereupon its radiance immediately faded. When she then sat back, the brightness intensified again, before finally fading a second time. Her experience lasted for 20 minutes before she turned on the light, which was dim compared with the dazzling glare which had previously filled the room. Mrs. P. Wilder was then so convinced of the authenticity of her sighting that she carefully made notes of her experience and sought out a local justice of the peace. She swore a statement before the official that she had watched a transparent phantom materialise in her bedroom. The connection became clear when, sadly that day, she received news that her brother had passed away in England. She later realised that the spirit had appeared at around the same time that her brother had lain dying. Parapsychologists studying crisis apparitions believe that the human mind has the power to somehow boost its signal in these cases and is able to produce sounds and images which can travel long distances. They can bear a message showing great care and concern, in this case seemingly softening its impact by first appearing as a ball of light and somehow calming the witness. Family fondness. Visits from close relatives are the most frequent incidents of crisis apparitions, and Josephine Hogg has experienced 2 such visits. The first eerie haunting occurred in 1978 when her family was living in Canberra. She had just climbed into bed when she suddenly knew with a deep conviction that her grandfather was in the house. At this stage she saw nothing but could hear him talking to her sons in their room, and a few minutes later to her sleeping daughter. She hurried into the girl's room and saw her grandfather fading away into the wall. She was convinced that he would now be going to visit her brother and his family on the other side of Canberra. She and her husband set off at sunrise the next morning and drove the 3 hours to Sydney, where they found her grandfather very ill and almost unaware of their presence. She was able to hold his hand and talk about happy past times before he slipped away. 4 years later, Josephine was on holiday in Tasmania and was sitting reading a newspaper at around 3 one afternoon. Her uncle Pat appeared at the end of the room and said to her that he hoped she and her husband would have a long and happy life together. She then phoned home to Sydney and was told that her uncle Pat had just passed away after an operation for throat cancer.